Have you ever wondered why no matter how much you work, save, or sacrifice, it always feels like someone else is quietly pulling the strings of your financial life? The truth is unsettling. There is a silent mechanism, a structure so deeply embedded in the modern economy that most people never question it, yet it dictates how money is created, distributed, borrowed, and ultimately controlled. This mechanism was not built overnight. It was engineered piece by piece, through decisions made by people who understood that real power does not come from laws or governments, but from the ability to shape the flow of money without ever appearing in the spotlight. And once you start tracing the origins of this silent scheme, you begin to see the same pattern repeating across time, across countries, and across every major financial shift that defines how we live today. What makes it even more disturbing is that the average person believes money is simply earned through work and spent through choice. But beneath that surface lies a system designed to ensure that every cent you touch is already part of a larger cycle, one that feeds upward, one that moves wealth from the many to the few with precision so subtle that most people never realize they are participating in it. This isn't about conspiracy. It's about structure, incentive, and a framework built slowly, deliberately, and intelligently. A framework that shapes interest rates, credit access, currency value, and even the way you understand debt. And once you notice the signs, it becomes impossible to unsee how coordinated the entire machine really is. You may start to question how much of your financial life is truly yours, and how much is influenced by forces you never learned about in school. You may realize that the rules of the game were written long before you were born, and that every economic crisis, every boom, every collapse follows a script that benefits the same groups again and again. As we peel back the layers of this structure, you will see how each part reinforces the next, creating the appearance of freedom while maintaining a system of quiet dependence that shapes your decisions without you noticing. This first step is about revealing the engine behind the curtain, the one that has been guiding your financial reality, without ever showing its face. Before we continue, tell me in the comments if you have ever felt like the financial system was designed to keep you one step behind. Your perspective matters because understanding these patterns is the first step toward breaking their influence. And if this introduction helped you see the topic through a new lens, make sure to like the video and check if you are subscribed, because what comes next reveals how this structure began and why it still dictates the world you live in today. To understand how this silent financial structure took shape, you have to go back to the moment when money stopped being just a medium of exchange and became a tool of influence. The origins of the modern system were not accidental. They emerged from crises, wars, political failures, and the ambitions of people who realized that whoever controlled the flow of credit would eventually control nations themselves. In earlier centuries, money was limited by physical assets. Gold could not be printed, silver could not be stretched, value had weight. But governments facing conflict or economic strain discovered that physical limitations made it impossible to fund their agendas. They needed a way to borrow more, spend more, expand more. And this need created an opening for a new kind of financial architecture. It began with lenders who understood that governments were the most reliable borrowers because they had something no private citizen possessed: the power to tax. Once rulers realized they could pledge future taxes in exchange for immediate funds, everything changed. Debt became perpetual. States no longer needed to wait for revenue. They could pull it from the future. And the people who facilitated this process gained unprecedented leverage. Suddenly, the individuals designing financial instruments were shaping national policy. Wars were funded not by treasure chests, but by bonds. Economic expansion was driven not by productivity, but by credit backed by promises. Slowly, a system emerged in which the creators of money were no longer governments alone, but private entities authorized to manage money on their behalf. The pivot point came when institutions developed the ability to create money not through mining or trade, but through lending. For the first time in history, money was generated by the simple act of writing numbers into ledgers. This innovation rewired the entire relationship between citizens and their economies. It allowed governments to expand far beyond their means, corporations to scale faster than production allowed, and individuals to live in a cycle where access to credit mattered more than actual savings. The system rewarded borrowing, not restraint. It encouraged dependence on financial intermediaries, not self-sufficiency. And once this architecture was established, every future crisis only deepened its roots. As centuries passed, these early decisions evolved into the foundations of modern finance. Institutions that started as small groups of merchants became central authorities. Debt instruments that once supported emergencies became permanent fixtures of national budgets. The mechanisms created to stabilize economies eventually grew powerful enough to shape them. What began as temporary solutions transformed into the core operating system of the global economy, a system engineered so subtly that most people today are unaware of how deeply it influences every financial choice they make. And each step built on the last, tightening the structure until it became nearly impossible to separate economic freedom from the mechanisms designed to manage it. As the foundations of this new financial architecture solidified, something even more consequential began to happen. The people who had once served merely as facilitators between governments and markets realized they could shape the system itself. They understood that debt was not just a contract. It was leverage. It was influence. It was a long-term claim on the future productivity of entire populations. And once this insight took hold, the architecture of modern finance shifted from a tool of necessity to an engineered framework of control. Elites found that by managing the movement of borrowed money, they could influence everything from national policies to social stability without ever appearing on a ballot or taking political office. The shift accelerated when these financial actors began developing structures that transformed temporary borrowing into permanent dependence. Governments discovered they could refinance endlessly instead of repaying. Banks learned they could multiply the impact of every deposit through fractional lending. Markets realized they could package and resell debt, turning obligations into tradable assets that enriched intermediaries while leaving the risk with the public. Over time, these layers formed a complex system where the original loan mattered less than the continuous flow of interest generated from it. The system no longer relied on production or innovation. It relied on the ability to extract value from an ever-expanding web of obligations. This is where the subtle brilliance of the scheme becomes clear. By turning debt into a commodity, elites created a mechanism that grows stronger with every transaction. Instead of wealth circulating evenly, it moves upward through fees, interest payments, and financial instruments designed to ensure that the same institutions benefit repeatedly. The structure rewards those who hold assets and punishes those who rely on wages. It concentrates financial power in the hands of those who can control credit creation, while making individuals, businesses, and even nations reliant on continuous borrowing to maintain basic stability. And yet, despite its complexity, the psychological component is just as important as the economic one. People are conditioned to view debt as normal, even necessary. Home ownership requires mortgages. Education requires loans. Economic growth requires government deficits. Every layer of society becomes tied to a mechanism that ensures money must always be borrowed from someone who profits when you do. What appears to be an ecosystem of opportunity is, beneath the surface, a perpetual engine designed to transfer value from the many to the few. And each generation inherits a system that feels too large, too entrenched, too technical to question, even though it affects every aspect of their financial reality. This evolution was not the result of a single decision, but a sequence of choices made by those who understood that control over credit meant control over the future. And as these structures matured, they laid the groundwork for institutions that would eventually operate far beyond the reach of ordinary citizens, shaping currencies, markets, and entire economies with decisions that most people never hear about until long after the effects have settled into their lives. As these financial structures expanded, the institutions built to oversee them gradually transformed from simple intermediaries into powerful centers of influence that operated quietly above the public's awareness. What began as organizations meant to stabilize markets evolved into entities capable of shaping entire economic landscapes with a single decision. Their influence was not expressed through speeches or elections, but through interest rates, liquidity injections, regulatory frameworks, and the subtle adjustments that determine the cost of borrowing for millions of people at once. And because their actions rarely make headlines in a way, the average person can understand. They operate with a level of autonomy that would be unthinkable for any political institution. This shift happened slowly, almost invisibly. Each economic crisis provided an opportunity for these institutions to expand their authority under the justification of preventing collapse. When markets trembled, they stepped in. When banks failed, they absorbed them. When governments struggled, they financed them. Over time, they positioned themselves as the only actors capable of maintaining stability in a system built on leverage and perpetual borrowing. Yet the more responsibility they assumed, the more indispensable they became, and the more insulated they grew from public oversight. Their decisions began shaping the direction of national economies, influencing currency values, determining which industries would thrive and which would fall into decline. Behind this rise was a simple reality. Control of money is control of behavior. When an institution can make borrowing cheaper or more expensive at will, it influences the choices of families, businesses, and governments without ever issuing a law. When it can expand or contract the supply of money with a few keystrokes, it shapes the rhythm of the economy itself. The public sees rising prices, falling wages, or tightening credit, but rarely connects those experiences to the decisions made in boardrooms far removed from daily life. And because these institutions speak a language so technical that most people cannot decipher it, they maintain authority through complexity. The less the public understands, the more freedom they have to operate. Their reach extends far beyond national borders. International networks form around them, spreading their influence across continents. Agreements between central authorities shape global flows of capital. Policy shifts in one country ripple instantly across the world. And as markets become more interconnected, the power of these institutions grows exponentially. They do not need to coerce anyone directly. The structure itself ensures compliance. Governments depend on them to finance deficits. Corporations rely on them to access capital. Citizens depend on them to keep savings stable. The entire system revolves around their decisions, even if most people never notice the connection. And yet, despite their enormous influence, these institutions rarely appear in public debates. Their role is treated as technical, neutral, and inevitable. But once you understand how the financial architecture evolved, it becomes clear that their rise was not a natural outcome. It was a strategic progression, one that gave them the ability to operate quietly at the center of the global economy, shaping outcomes without ever needing the public's approval. If this made you see how much hidden influence operates behind everyday financial decisions, leave a comment sharing your perspective, your doubts, or even your personal experience with how these systems affect your life. As the influence of these institutions expanded, another transformation quietly reshaped the financial world: the rise of credit as the primary engine of economic life. For most of human history, money represented something physical, something earned, saved, or exchanged through direct value. But once borrowing became the foundation of growth, the relationship between people and money shifted in a way that would permanently redefine modern society. Instead of being a tool people controlled, money became a mechanism they depended on. And credit became the invisible thread binding individuals, governments, and corporations to the same expanding system. This shift did not happen through force. It happened through normalization. Credit was framed not as a risk, but as opportunity. It allowed families to buy homes long before they could save enough. It enabled businesses to expand faster than their revenues allowed. It gave governments the ability to fund programs, wars, and infrastructure without raising taxes. And beneath all these benefits, a deeper structural transformation took place. The constant expansion of credit became essential for the system to function. Without it, markets would contract, consumption would slow, and the illusion of continuous growth would collapse almost instantly. As reliance on credit increased, financial institutions realized they could shape not only the cost of borrowing, but the desires and expectations of entire populations. People were encouraged to view life milestones not through savings, but through loans. A home was no longer a reward for decades of discipline. It became an obligation financed over 30 years. Education shifted from a public good to a private investment funded by debt. Even everyday purchases migrated from cash to credit, tying consumption to interest rather than affordability. The more people borrowed, the more profitable the system became for those who controlled it. This evolution also introduced a new cycle of vulnerability. Because credit allowed people to live beyond their immediate means, any tightening in lending conditions could instantly destabilize millions of households. A small rise in interest rates could reshape spending patterns. A shift in lending standards could determine who moved forward in life and who fell behind. Stability became dependent on access to borrowed money, and this dependency gave institutions unprecedented leverage over economic behavior. The power was subtle, quiet, and woven into the fabric of daily life. For businesses, the transformation was just as profound. Entire industries emerged based on the expectation of constant borrowing. Expansion was measured not by cash on hand, but by the ability to secure financing. Startups built multi-million-dollar valuations before generating profits because access to credit mattered more than immediate performance. Debt became both fuel and anchor, propelling growth while ensuring that the institutions providing the capital remained at the center of every major economic decision. And for governments, credit became the backbone of stability. Tax revenue alone could no longer sustain programs or manage crises. Instead, continuous borrowing became the norm, justified by the belief that future growth would cover future obligations. But as the decades passed, the gap between projections and reality widened, and the system required ever larger injections of credit just to maintain the appearance of balance. This quiet transformation reshaped the very meaning of money. It turned economic life into a cycle of dependence, where access to credit determined opportunity, and where the expansion of debt became the defining feature of modern prosperity. And with each passing decade, the system grew more complex and more entrenched, setting the stage for the emergence of new actors who would operate even further from the public eye, shaping global finance with influence that stretched far beyond national borders. As credit became the core engine of the global system, new entities emerged to manage, coordinate, and quietly influence the flow of money across borders. These were not traditional banks or government institutions bound by local laws and public oversight. They were networks, alliances, and financial organisms operating in the shadows of international markets, shaping the policies of entire nations without needing political authority. Their power came not from public recognition, but from their position at the crossroads of global capital, where decisions made in private meetings could determine the direction of economies thousands of miles away. These entities did not rise suddenly. They evolved gradually as the global financial landscape grew too interconnected for any single government to control. International organizations were created to stabilize exchange rates, manage crises, and ensure cooperation between countries. But as their responsibilities grew, so did their influence. What began as advisory roles transformed into decisive power over fiscal strategies, lending conditions, monetary reforms, and rescue operations. Nations experiencing financial turmoil found themselves subject to the terms and philosophies of institutions that did not answer to their citizens, but to broader global interests. At the same time, private actors gained unprecedented reach. Large financial firms expanded far beyond the scale of traditional banking. Asset managers, investment houses, and multinational institutions began controlling sums of money larger than the GDP of most countries. Their portfolios spanned continents, industries, and governments, giving them the ability to shift markets with quiet reallocation rather than public announcements. Their influence was subtle, embedded in the logistics of modern finance. When they moved, markets followed, currencies reacted, and governments took notice. These entities developed a unique form of power. They could shape outcomes without issuing commands. When they favored certain assets, industries grew. When they reduced exposure, entire sectors contracted. Their investment strategies set benchmarks for global markets, and smaller institutions, pension funds, and national banks mirrored their decisions to avoid falling behind. What looked like market consensus was often the ripple effect of a few major players adjusting positions behind closed doors. The language they used was deliberately technical. Discussions about liquidity, risk premiums, or market stabilization served as a protective layer, ensuring the public would never fully understand the stakes of their decisions. Yet those decisions determined interest rates for millions, borrowing costs for governments, and investment flows for global industries. While politicians debated policies in front of cameras, real influence was shaped quietly in conference rooms, quarterly reports, and strategic reallocations invisible to most people. The deeper the system became, the harder it was to distinguish oversight from dependence. Governments relied on these entities to finance development, stabilize currencies, and prevent collapse during crises. Corporations relied on them for investment. Citizens relied on them to protect pensions and savings. The world became intertwined with institutions that operated across borders, above jurisdictions, and beyond the reach of typical democratic processes. And as credit kept expanding, these actors grew even more central. They became the silent anchors of the global economy, not through force, but through indispensability. Their presence ensured stability, but their influence shaped outcomes far more than any public institution ever could. Their rise marked a new phase in the evolution of financial power, where the most important decisions were made far from public view, by entities whose names most people would struggle to recognize, yet whose influence affected every aspect of daily economic life. As these global financial entities expanded their influence, the consequences for ordinary people deepened in ways that were rarely acknowledged publicly. The system functioned smoothly for those positioned at the top, but for households living paycheck to paycheck, the effects accumulated slowly, silently, shaping entire generations. The cost of living rose faster than wages. Housing shifted from a basic need to a speculative asset. Education became a lifelong financial burden. Healthcare turned into a recurring expense that could destabilize even financially responsible families. None of these developments were accidents. They emerged from structural incentives built into the system, where rising costs increased borrowing, and borrowing reinforced the need for more credit expansion. Over time, people adjusted to these pressures not because they accepted them, but because they had no alternative. Young adults entering the workforce found themselves locked into cycles of debt before they even had a chance to build real savings. Parents worked longer hours to compensate for stagnating wages. Retirees discovered that decades of contributions were no longer enough to guarantee security. The burden grew heavier each decade, subtly eroding the sense of stability previous generations once enjoyed. Even technological progress, which promised convenience and opportunity, often introduced new costs, new dependencies, and new reasons to borrow. The system offered just enough comfort to prevent collapse, yet never enough to allow most people to break free. The emotional impact was just as profound as the financial one. People began to feel disconnected from the promises they were raised to believe in. The idea that hard work guaranteed advancement no longer matched their reality. Saving for the future felt less like preparation and more like a struggle against endless, rising costs. Economic mobility, once a defining ideal, quietly faded into a myth reserved for a shrinking minority. And as the gap widened between what people were told to expect and what they actually experienced, frustration grew beneath the surface, feeding a sense of mistrust toward institutions that claimed to protect them. Communities were reshaped by these pressures. Families delayed milestones once considered normal. Cities became battlegrounds of affordability. Rural areas hollowed out, as opportunities concentrated elsewhere. Social class divisions hardened. Even cultural expectations shifted, with entire lifestyles recalibrated around financial constraints that never seemed to ease. The system did not simply affect bank accounts. It altered identities, aspirations, and beliefs. It changed how people viewed their own worth, their future prospects, and their place in society. Yet the structure remained intact, functioning exactly as intended, creating an environment where dependence on credit became unavoidable, where rising costs kept demand for loans steady, and where the continuous flow of interest ensured that wealth traveled upward. Most people never traced their daily struggles back to the architecture of the global financial system, because they were conditioned to believe those struggles were personal failures rather than predictable outcomes. But the truth is that the system's design shapes every choice they make, every challenge they face, and every dollar they earn. If any part of this reflects what you or someone you know has experienced, leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your story. Your perspective helps expose the real impact of a system most people never see clearly. As the pressures on ordinary people intensified, the underlying logic of the system became easier to see, at least for those willing to look closely. The core of the structure was not simply about lending or managing money. It was about shaping behavior through monetary design. Every component of the financial architecture worked together to ensure that the cycle of borrowing, spending, and repaying continued indefinitely. The manipulation was subtle, embedded not in explicit commands but in incentives that guided decisions long before individuals realized they were being influenced. The system didn't need to force anyone to participate. It only needed to make alternatives impossible. At the heart of this logic was the idea that money should lose value over time. Inflation, framed as a natural part of economic growth, quietly ensured that saving became a losing strategy. People who tried to store wealth found their efforts undermined by rising prices, while those who borrowed benefited from paying back loans with less valuable dollars. This dynamic encouraged spending, discouraged saving, and made borrowing not just common but rational. The system rewarded behaviors that kept money circulating upward through interest payments, fees, and financial products that seemed beneficial on the surface, but ultimately widened the gap between those who controlled capital and those who depended on it. Another layer of the mechanism lay in how financial education was presented to the public. People were taught how to budget, but not how currencies are manipulated. They learned how to manage expenses, but not how monetary policy shapes those expenses. They were encouraged to invest, yet never shown who truly benefits from constant market participation. This selective education created a population fluent in personal responsibility, yet unaware of the invisible levers that dictated the boundaries of their financial lives. When people struggled, they blamed themselves instead of recognizing the system that made their progress so difficult. At the institutional level, monetary policy became a tool for steering entire nations. Interest rates could stimulate spending or restrain it. Liquidity injections could rescue markets at the exact moment instability threatened the upper tiers of the system. Currency values could be adjusted in ways that favored exporters, punished savers, or shifted the balance of global trade. To the public, these actions appeared technical and distant, but in reality, they shaped everything from food prices to job availability. The design was elegant in its simplicity: manage expectations, guide behavior, and maintain dependence. Even global crises revealed how the mechanism functioned. When markets faltered, the system responded not by reducing its complexity, but by deepening it. New programs, new instruments, new forms of intervention were introduced, each one reinforcing the idea that stability required continual oversight from the very institutions that benefited most from instability. The pattern repeated across decades. Volatility created justification for intervention. Intervention increased centralization. Centralization strengthened the system's ability to influence economic life. And at each stage, the public became more reliant on structures they barely understood. The logic behind it all was not malicious in appearance. It was rational, methodical, and carefully aligned with the interests of those who shaped it. The goal was not to create chaos, but to maintain control. Control over currency, over expectations, over the rhythm of economic life. And as long as people accepted the rules without questioning their origin, the system functioned perfectly, guiding the flow of money upward while appearing to serve the needs of the very people it quietly constrained. Despite the system's scale and influence, one of its most remarkable features is how invisible it remains to the people living inside it. Most individuals go through life without ever questioning why certain financial patterns repeat, why economic crises seem to appear on schedule, or why their personal progress feels restrained by forces they can't quite identify. This lack of awareness is not the result of apathy. It is the direct outcome of a structure designed to operate quietly, shaping outcomes in ways that feel natural, inevitable, and beyond dispute. When the rules of a system become indistinguishable from reality itself, most people assume the rules are unchangeable. Part of this invisibility comes from the fact that the system works most effectively when people are focused on their individual struggles. A family trying to pay rising rent does not have the time or energy to analyze global monetary policy. A worker juggling multiple jobs is unlikely to explore how credit expansion drives inflation. People become consumed by the immediate demands of survival, and in that state, they rarely question the deeper architecture shaping those demands. The system thrives on this fragmentation, keeping individuals so busy navigating daily pressures that they overlook the mechanisms responsible for creating those pressures in the first place. Another reason few people notice the scheme is that it presents itself as progress. Technological convenience, faster transactions, digital payments, and instant credit approvals all create an illusion of empowerment. When financial tools become more accessible, people believe they have greater control, even as those tools bind them more tightly to the structure behind them. The ease of access masks the cost of dependence. With every swipe, every loan, every subscription, individuals become further integrated into a system that counts on their participation to sustain itself. Cultural narratives also play a powerful role. Society repeatedly reinforces the idea that success is a matter of discipline, hard work, and perseverance. While these values are important, they obscure the reality that the financial environment is engineered to favor certain players over others. When people face setbacks, they assume personal failure rather than recognizing structural obstacles. This mindset keeps them compliant, striving within boundaries they did not choose, while the system quietly extracts value from their efforts. Media coverage contributes to the illusion as well. Economic events are framed as isolated incidents rather than symptoms of a larger design. Rising prices are explained through simplified stories. Market downturns are treated as unpredictable. Government borrowing is framed as necessary, unavoidable, or purely political. Rarely does mainstream discourse acknowledge the underlying architecture that makes these patterns inevitable. Without a clear narrative connecting these events, people lack the framework to interpret what they are experiencing, leaving them unaware of the greater forces shaping their financial reality. And perhaps the most effective tool of all is complexity. The language of modern finance is deliberately dense, filled with technical jargon that discourages curiosity. Terms like liquidity operations, asset purchases, yield curves, and monetary interventions create a barrier between the public and the truth. When something feels too complicated to understand, people defer to the experts, assuming the system must be functioning as intended. This trust allows the structure to operate without resistance, protected not by secrecy, but by confusion. What few realize is that their lack of awareness is not a failure on their part. It is the system working exactly as designed. And as long as people continue navigating their lives, without recognizing the architecture surrounding them, the mechanism remains intact, guiding their decisions while remaining hidden in plain sight. Now, as we arrive at the culmination of this silent scheme, it becomes clear just how enduring and inescapable it has become. Every mechanism, every institution, every subtle incentive converges into a single, coherent system that controls the movement of money on a global scale. From governments to corporations, from households to multinational networks, nearly every financial decision is influenced by this framework. It does not rely on coercion or force, it relies on participation, trust, and the unbroken circulation of debt and credit. The very design ensures continuity, compelling actors at every level to contribute to the same structure, feeding its growth and sustaining its control. What is remarkable is that the system has adapted to crises without collapsing. Every recession, every market crash, every economic shock has been absorbed and redirected, often strengthening the mechanisms rather than weakening them. Institutions step in precisely when instability threatens the continuity of the flow, guaranteeing that the cycle of borrowing, repayment, and interest remains uninterrupted. And while these interventions stabilize markets for a moment, they simultaneously expand the influence of those controlling the system, consolidating power in ways invisible to the general public. Ordinary people continue to navigate their financial lives largely unaware of the forces shaping every option, every decision, every opportunity. The design is also generational. Each generation inherits the system, participates in it, and unknowingly reinforces it, passing the structure forward without ever questioning its origin or ultimate purpose. Patterns of consumption, credit dependence, and investment behavior are learned early, normalized over time, and made to feel natural. By the time individuals recognize the system, they are already deeply embedded within it, and their options for independent action are constrained. The architecture of money has become a framework that sustains itself through the choices and behaviors it encourages, creating a self-perpetuating cycle that benefits those who understand and control it. Understanding this structure is not merely an academic exercise. It is essential for anyone who wishes to navigate the modern economy with clarity. By recognizing the patterns, the incentives, and the hidden architecture, people gain insight into the forces shaping their financial reality. They see why debt, interest, currency fluctuations, and policy decisions are not random, but part of a deliberate design that ensures control, continuity, and concentration of wealth. Awareness itself is the first step toward any form of empowerment within this system, revealing the levers of influence that otherwise remain hidden. If you've made it this far, it's time to engage. Subscribe to stay informed about the mechanisms shaping our world, leave a comment sharing your reaction or what surprised you most, and give this video a like if it opened your eyes. And while you're here, there's another video that complements this topic perfectly. Click over and continue exploring how this silent financial structure affects every decision you make. The deeper you understand it, the more prepared you are to navigate its influence with awareness and insight.